Martha's home. And so he would frequent there. And leading up to that crucifixion, that what we call Passion Week, Jesus is staying with Mary of Bethany and Martha, of course, and traveling back and forth to Jerusalem. So I want to kind of set that stage for you so you understand the relationship. Jesus knew them fairly well. Jesus loved them, loved the two sisters and Lazarus very much. But I want to focus on, we're going to actually cover, there are 3 times that the Bible mentions an interaction between Jesus and Mary of Bethany, the other Mary, as we're going to call her, tonight and Sunday morning. There's 3 interactions that we see, and we're going to go over the first 2 tonight because it's going to be the perfect framework for Sunday. So there's two interactions that, so we're going to start with the first, and we're going to skip to the third, and you'll understand why. And then on Sunday, I'm going to bring it to the second interaction, which I believe Sunday morning will bring so much healing to those of you that are heartsick, who are disillusioned, especially to those of you who have been disenfranchised from the church. As one person put it, that you're in the wake of Christianity, kind of sprinkled or littered throughout the wake of Christianity. Christianity has a way of, oftentimes, and religion has a way of kind of leaving a wake in its path. And we sometimes do more damage than we do good in a lot of situations. And you might have been, or someone you know might have been, a part of a people group or a part of somebody that got damaged or hurt or disillusioned by the church or by religion, by faith, if you will, maybe by God himself. And so we're going to tackle that on Sunday, but let's set it up with this. You're going to learn something, hopefully. At least I did as I studied this. Luke 10, let's go straight to that. This is interaction number 1. And so this is 6 months prior to the Passion Week. This is 6 months prior to Jesus being crucified, give or take a month or 2, based on the timeline. And, theologians are much smarter than I. They think it's about 6 months prior to Passion Week. And Jesus is in the home of Mary and Martha and Lazarus, and he is teaching people in that home. He is teaching them. Many of his teachings or many of his gatherings would be in somebody's home. And depending on how many people they were gathering, they would find a home or a yard that would accommodate them. And so he really was a rabbi. He was a teacher. And so he'd be teaching in this home. And in Luke 10, it says, now, in verse 1, as they were traveling along, he entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. She had a sister called Mary, who was seated at the Lord's feet, listening to his word. But Martha was distracted with all her preparations. And she came up to him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the serving alone? I'm going to stop there for a moment. Some translations don't just say that she was listening to his word, but some translations say that she was learning of him. She was literally studying and learning his ways, who he was, what he was made out of, how he spoke, but how he operated, how he responded to things. And so she was learning of his ways. It's important you understand what she was doing at the feet of Jesus here. Let's go back in verse 40. Martha was distracted with all her preparations. She came up to him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the serving alone? Then tell her to help me. But the Lord answered and said to her, Martha, Martha, you are worried and bothered about so many things, but only one thing is necessary. For Mary has chosen the good part, which shall not be taken away from her. So I want you to see what happens here. Martha is in the kitchen. She's doing her thing. And in this time, genders were very segregated. And so the women would be, in the kitchen or making preparations or by their stone fire stove or whatever what they were doing, if they're making bread or some sort of pita or whatever it may be at the time. They would be preparing, and they wouldn't necessarily be in the room while the men or a man or a male rabbi was teaching. But Mary understood something, and there's a lot of sermons about Mary and Martha and the interaction here, but I want you to focus on what's going on. Martha comes in. She doesn't even necessarily address Mary. She goes right to the rabbi, right to Jesus. She's essentially challenging the tradition of this woman sitting amongst probably predominantly men, sitting at the feet of Jesus. And I love what Jesus says to her. He says, Martha, Martha, you're worried and bothered about so many things, but only one thing is necessary. for Mary has chosen the good part, which shall not be taken away from her. And so as we read that, as we study that, I want you to notice that Martha is essentially, she's almost throwing shade, as we would say today, towards Mary, because it's kind of like, if I'm a woman and I've got to be making preparations in the kitchen, you do too. And besides, you're not educated. You're not scholarly like the men because they didn't have access to education. And so the idea that you're sitting at his feet and trying to extract or learn something from what he's saying is a waste of time. So make yourself useful, because it says, that Martha was distracted with her preparations. And so, and Mary was just kind of wasting, if you will, her time and her presence at the feet of Jesus in the eyes of Martha. Jesus makes it very clear that Mary taking the time to learn of him is not a waste of time. Now, you can extract some things personally for you. It's never a waste of time to sit at the feet of Jesus and to learn of his ways. That's not what I'm preaching on, but you can definitely kind of get a little idea of maybe what God is saying to you through that. As we continue on, we find ourselves in that Passion Week, the week leading up. We're going to skip the second time that Jesus and Mary of Bethany meet, and we're going to jump to the third time. And that is the week, if you will, of the crucifixion, that Passion Week. It's found in John 12. Starts in verse 1. Jesus, therefore, 6 days before the Passover, came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus has raised from the dead. So they made him a supper there, and Martha was serving. But Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table with them. Now, you have to understand that specifically in John 12, they are making mention of Lazarus being there, because in John 11, Lazarus is raised from the dead. It's actually something we're going to get into on Sunday, and there's some powerful things in there I've never heard or understood before. But Lazarus was in the chapter before this, raised from the dead. So the writer's making it clear that our homeboy Lazarus is alive and he is at the table. He was dead for 3 days, but he is there at the table. And at this table would have been all men. It would have been all men. It would have been probably some of Jesus's disciples, Lazarus, maybe some other men, and Jesus, of course. And it says that Mary then took, and it says that they were reclining around the table. In the Middle East, even today, they will actually sit or recline on the ground or on a little shelf where there are cushions around the area where they're eating. And so that's still going on today, whether it's in Iraq or in Israel or in Iran or any of those places. This is still going on. This is how they would eat. And so they weren't like laying back on their lazy boy. They would have been kind of around the dinner area or the dinner table. Mary then took, in verse 3, a pound of very costly perfume, you know it, of pure nard, and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But of course, you have to imagine that they're murmuring and complaining. This is an inappropriate, very inappropriate act. What Mary did 6 months ago was inappropriate. She broke protocol. She went again the cultural norms and the gender norms of the day. That gender bias was very strong in how it was a very misogynistic society, very xenophobic society. And she went against the grain big time, but this one takes it a step further. It's not just, and I have to say this, once again, where do we find Mary? We find her, she comes in, picture this, she brings this box of ointment, oil, and perfume, and she goes right to his feet. She goes right to his feet. I love that. We found her at his feet 6 months ago. Of course, we're going to talk about the second one on Sunday. We're skipping to the third one. We find her at his feet again. This time, it's not to learn of him, but it's to pour something costly upon his feet. It's to, again, waste something in the eyes of the people around her. They would have been very uncomfortable. See, Mary actually made them feel very uncomfortable in what she did. She made Martha feel uncomfortable in the first one, but she made these men very uncomfortable in this moment. It wouldn't have been normal for a woman to just stop them talking in a room and not just to interrupt them while they were eating and talking, but on top of that, to do something very intimate, very, intimate's the right word. It was something that wouldn't be done in this situation ever. We don't know what motivated Mary, but Mary nevertheless finds herself at the feet. And as the disciples are beginning to murmur, in verse 4, you can put it up there, our buddy Judas says, one of his disciples who was intending to betray him said, why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor people? Now he said this not because he was concerned about the poor, but because he was a thief. And as he had the money box, he used to pilfer what was put into it. Therefore Jesus said, let her alone that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For you will always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. Now, if you continue to read here, we didn't put it in there. We'll kind of maybe skim over it on Sunday. But Judas steps up and he's like, he doesn't actually care about the poor, but Judas is like, listen, I don't really think this is appropriate for many reasons. First of all, she's a woman and she shouldn't be doing this here. Second off, what she's wasting away or pouring out on your feet could be sold for 300 denarii and we could feed the poor with it. Of course, we know based on the scripture that Judas was probably going to steal part of that money once it got into the money box. That's besides the point. He's saying this is a waste. Again, Mary finds herself at the feet of Jesus. This time not learning of him, this time worshiping him. Worshiping him. Pouring out perfume, pouring out ointment. It's the symbols, the oil, and the costly thing at the feet of Jesus, wiping his feet with her tears and her hair. That picture is a picture of worship. So the first time she's being taught, she's learning of him. The second time or the third time, she's worshiping him. These are the first and third encounter that Mary of Bethany has with Jesus. Judas kind of takes the spot of what I think a lot of believers today are stuck in. He's kind of morally superior. It's kind of this one-upmanship. It's kind of like you think you're gonna, schmooze in here on Jesus, but what you're doing is wasteful. We could feed a lot of people with that money, Mary. It's you can imagine a very calculated statement by Judas himself. Jesus, of course, looks at them, this misogynistic, xenophobic, clearly, distorted picture of the way God intended man and woman to interact culturally. It's completely distorted. And Jesus, of course, wants to set the record straight. And he probably has an impending sense in his mind at this point that the end was near, that soon he would be handed over, soon he would be murdered and crucified. And so with that picture and understanding of the road that Jesus was getting ready to travel on, this week leading up, he says something that when I was reading it today, I began to weep. But he says two things really that are so important. He says, this woman, essentially, that you're picking on, that broke the rules of our culture, that stepped out of line, stepped out of place. Come on, somebody needs to hear this. Who didn't fit into the box. What she's done today. You all are sitting here and want to talk and bloviate and come up with all these theories and ideas and be around Jesus the King, the Messiah. This is post him riding triumphantly into the city. You all have this thing going on, but what she's done that made you all feel so uncomfortable, she's actually the one that's preparing me to be buried. She's getting me ready. She's honoring me she's anointing my body with balm for my burial. Mary didn't even know what she was doing. Mary had no clue of what was happening or going on. Mary was just acting upon whatever inspired her to do this. She had to push past all of the crap, if I can say it, that religion, that arrogance, that moral superiority puts in the way of people acting upon what they believe the Spirit of God is telling them in a moment. So she comes and she once again wastes this on Jesus. And Jesus goes on to say this is one of the most powerful statements. It's actually the only time in the entire scriptures that Jesus utters this sentence. It's almost like a second sacrament, a second communion. If you remember, Jesus said when they received communion that from here on forward, I want you to do this in remembrance of me. The only other time he made reference to the remembrance of something is in this moment in John 12, where he looks at these men who were judging her, who were fired up, who thought they had her nailed to the wall for how inappropriate she was acting. She was breaking the rules. She was doing something. She didn't know her place. Jesus stops and he says, what this woman has done will be spoken about. I want you to repeat this story. Wherever you tell the story of me, I want her story to go with it. He puts such value, and I've heard this preached before, where we realize or we hear that, that it was the value of what she poured out on him. And so, you should just give and sacrifice everything you have. And that's a part of worship. I get that part of it. But the other part of this story that we're going to extract tonight before we get to the mega grand finale on Sunday, the other point I want to extract here is that she broke the rules. She broke the rules 6 months ago when she was sitting and not in the kitchen. She broke the rules as she came into this group of men that were sitting around the table. She made some people uncomfortable. She was going with what she felt she was supposed to do versus what she knew she was supposed to do. She had to break away from the way she was raised. She had to break away from the box that she'd been put in because of her gender. You know what I'm saying tonight? Harvest, and those of you that watch these live streams, I'm going to tell you, as one of the pastors, we're okay with breaking some rules. We're okay with making some people feel awkward. We're okay with people being a little nervous when they hear our name. We're okay with putting stuff out on Facebook that might not fit into your box or your neighbor's box, your granddaddy's box, your nephew's box. We're okay with doing it because we believe that in this time, in this hour, God's not asking us, quote unquote, to just keep doing the same thing we've always done. We believe that in this hour that God is asking us, yes, to be sacrificial, yes, to not be afraid to pour out. But some of you need to understand you have been caged. You have been kept in a box because of your gender, because of the color of your skin, because of how much money you have in your bank account or who your parents were or what you do for a living or however we use things to classify people. So many people out there have disqualified themselves or allowed themselves to be disqualified, but nothing would stop Mary. A woman during these times would have been maybe this much above your cattle or your animals. Very little rights. You think Mary cared? No. You think Mary waited around to be invited to come to his feet? No. You think Mary waited or knocked at the door, mousy, waiting for Jesus to say, sure, come in and join the boys? No. Mary came in because she knew it was important. Jesus made it a point in both stories to say, what she's done is important. Mary understands the importance of learning of me and worshiping me. But Mary also understands the importance of pushing the boundaries, breaking some rules, making some people feel uncomfortable, if in the end, she's able to sit at my feet. I don't care, really. Oh, and this is just the warm-up for Sunday, I promise you. I don't really care what people say. I don't really care what people are thinking necessarily. about the direction and the heart of this place in this church. We want to sit at his feet. We want to sit at his feet. We want to see those eyes looking at us. We want to know beyond a shadow of a doubt that we didn't allow religion or tradition or money or power or influence from the outside to control or keep us out of the room. We need to press into the room and be at the feet of Jesus, to learn of his ways, to worship him. As a matter of fact, most churches have patterned their entire ministry on those two things. A lot of us have worship spaces like the one I'm in right now. A lot of us have classrooms to teach, to learn, to do adult Sunday school. Sunday morning is broken up into two things, really. It's worship with our voices and our hands and our hearts, worship with our money. That's the nard, the ointment, the perfume. And then we go into sitting at his feet and learning of his ways. But we don't really talk about the second encounter that Mary of Bethany had with Jesus. We don't really have room for the way Mary acted in her second encounter. On Sunday, we're fixing to make some room in our church for every disillusioned person, for every person that's been hurt by the church, for every person that feels like God turned their back on them. We're going to make some room on Sunday morning during our drive-in service. If you can't make it, join us online. You're not going to want to miss it. We'll see you at 10 a.m. live on Facebook or in our drive-through, or not drive-through, drive up. You'll actually park service on Sunday morning for the conclusion, part 2 of The Other Mary, where we realize that there is a middle ground that we have missed. And there's a lot of people that have been left out because they maybe did the first encounter and they maybe did the third encounter, but it's the second encounter that many of us turned our back on fellow believers because their journey didn't look the way we expected it to look. Join us Sunday morning for the rest of this. We'll see you then.